Amid concerns for rising public debt stock, the Senate has given approval to the request by President Muhammadu Buhari to restructure the 22.7 trillion naira Ways and Means loan advanced to the federal government by the Central Bank of Nigeria. The Ways and Means provision allows the federal government to borrow short-term or seek emergency finance from the CBN to fund delayed government's expected cash receipts of fiscal deficits. Since the government started experiencing a significant shortfall in revenue, it now relies on the Apex Bank to finance its expenditure programs via Ways and Means, which balance as of December 19, 2022 stood at 22.7 trillion naira. Joining me on the show today is the Head of Research and Policy Advisory at Budget, Mr. Inyobong Hussein. It will help us look at the alternatives for loan despite the need to develop our country, Nigeria. It's good to have you join us on Business Nigeria. Really, a lot of questions as President Muhammadu Buhari wraps up his tenure as President of Nigeria. But I want to first get your reaction to the state of Nigeria's debt and how sustainable is this considering our revenue challenges?
For having me. I mean, as you would know, there's nothing necessarily too alarming about Nigeria's, debt to GDP ratio, which the multilateral agencies would often benchmark Nigeria's debt sustainability situation, against. But the situation we find ourselves in is that by the time you look at our debt to revenue ratio, that's where we need to be worried. If you look at the trend from 2020 to 2022 last year, you would see that in 2020 when COVID kicked in, and of course, we were hit with, fiscal shocks. We saw that about 97% of our revenues that year went to servicing our debt. And so what that meant was that almost all of the funds that was used for recurrent expenditure, for capital expenditure, was borrowed. Now, if you come to 2022, even if that the percentage of what we spend on servicing our debt has reduced compared to 2020, you still see that it's as high as almost 81%, meaning that about 81% of our revenues generated between January and November for 2022 last year was spent on servicing our debt. Now, if you add this current Ways and Means, when it eventually becomes securitized, as the National Assembly has given its approval, that would increase our debt debt levels, as the case may be, and that definitely would have a significant impact on our debt service costs, especially if you look at the charges on Ways and Means, which is higher than the charges, on domestic debts and foreign debts, as the case may be.
Some persons would say this is not peculiar to Nigeria, as we see some other big economies in the world also struggling to maintain the rise in inflation. But now that the Senate has approved extra budgetary funding for the president to the tune of 22.7 trillion naira, I want to get your reaction to the Ways and Means saga. I know there could be some questions about the Ways and Means. People want to understand what it actually means. So that has been on for a while. So let me get your reactions first to this, and we'll continue the conversation from there.
So just to clarify, the Senate did not approve extra budgetary, funds for the federal government to spend. It just addressed a request that was placed before it by the president to securitize Ways and Means that had been accumulated between 2015 and date. And the value of what had been accumulated in terms of CBN overdraft or Ways and Means, as the case may be, was 22.7 trillion. So this is money that has already been borrowed and spent. But what the National Assembly is now trying to do is to look for a way to give permission to the CBN to securitize these loans so that it can be converted into bonds, and then the federal government can repay back these loans over a long period of time. So just to clarify, it's not an approval for extra budgetary funds by the Senate. It was just to securitize the funds that have already been borrowed from the CBN through overdraft and has been spent. I just needed to clarify that.
Yeah, I like that you were able to help us clarify that, because Nigerians, whenever we hear debt shock and then we hear some trillion naira in the bag, we're just saying, oh God, our government is borrowing again. But if we have options to development, do we have options to development if we don't borrow? If we do, can you highlight some of the options that we have as a country?
I mean, borrowing is not entirely a bad thing, but if you look at the Nigerian case study, you would see that this particular means of borrowing, which is through the ways and means, as one that has come up because, and in my own opinion, I think the government has you would see that there's a lot more that should have happened in terms of government efforts in generating revenues as against just going to the CBN for overdraft, which by the way is in breach of the CBN Act, which clearly stipulates the threshold that the allowable threshold for the federal government to make such borrowings from the CBN. And clearly, in the last couple of years, that particular section of the CBN Act has been breached without anyone being held accountable. And we now find ourselves in a situation now where the Senate is giving approvals for the ways and means to be securitized without holding anybody accountable for breaching laws that were enacted by this same National Assembly. So are we giving, express, passage for, persons who have found themselves, in public office to continually break the law without any repercussions? That's one end of the stick. The other end, if you look at other revenue efforts that government should be making, I mean, over the last 3 years, there was a huge, sort of cry around the operating surpluses, which is what MDAs are supposed to be. That's revenue generating MDAs of the federal government, or GOEs as the case may be, are supposed to be remitting into the consolidated revenue fund account of the federal government, which should form part of the revenue pool for government spending. But what we saw, in the last 2 years or 3 years, I mean, say for last year, when some efforts had been made to, get the MDAs to remit, was that MDAs of government who were drawing funds from the budget blatantly refused to remit these operating surpluses into the consolidated revenue fund account. And so instead of government to rally these MDAs to remit these funds, it was easier to approach the CBN to borrow to now fund the budget. Apart from that, I mean, you have subsidy, which is in the eye of the storm. It was projected, if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework for 2023 to 2025, it was projected that in a business as usual situation, our oil subsidy envelope would be close to 7 trillion naira, about 6.7 trillion naira. Now, for you to know the magnitude of this sort of funds utilized in subsidy, you would have to juxtapose that with what exactly it is the states raised as. And so if the federal government is going to spend 6.7 trillion naira on subsidy this year, that will tell you that that's going to be more than what the 36 states of the federation were able to gather cumulatively as revenue for 2021. So that tells you, in terms of opportunity cost, what the funds that have been used to fund subsidy would otherwise have done if they had gone to, if they had been spent on very, very critical sectors, areas, programs, activities in the respective budgets of the states and the federal government, on critical areas that would stimulate growth and, reduce poverty as the case may be. But with the subsidy regime, we find out that citizens are getting very little value for money. Reason being that in a study by the World Bank recently, it was it was revealed that only about 25% of households, benefit from the subsidy regime, as the case may be. The remaining 75% is what, MDAs, big corporations, sort of often benefit as subsidy. And so you ask yourself, are we really getting sort of value for money if we continue with this regime, which, by the way, as it is not something that the federal government can fund. We are borrowing to fund subsidy, and that's not sustainable.
I know your organization has done some research and documentation on states' IGR. We appreciate you for that. But some states, as you know, do not generate enough funds to grow the economy. What should state governors be doing to increase their IGR?
Oh, definitely a lot. I mean, there are a lot of governance reforms, which, I would admit that, from 2018 have happened in the states owing to the World Bank SIFTAS program. But there used to be, issues around ghost workers. And so with the advent of the SIFTAS program, states, were able to implement, were able to capture biometrically the civil servants in the states and link their BVN to the payroll, which led to massive savings for the states. The second thing, which some states have commenced but have not fully operationalized, is to sort of operationalize their treasury single account. There are still some states that, sort of run multiple accounts that, where funds are not being swept in treasury single account. What that does is that there's room for leakages. And so if you have multiple accounts being run by a state, different MDAs within a state, that is not under the purview of the central government, as the case may be, what happens is those will now serve as leakages for revenues, to be, sort of stolen from the purse, as the case may be, revenues which otherwise should have been utilized in funding the budget. If you look at the 2021, fiscal report for the 36 states, there was a fiscal deficit of over ₦1 trillion cumulatively for the 36 states, meaning that the states are not even raising enough revenue to fund their expenditures. They had to rely on some form of borrowing to be able to fund their budgets, as the case may be. So there's no money to be stolen, as the case may be. So that would mean that these states would need to, plug these leakages through these sort of reforms to ensure that little revenues that are raised by the states are being, collected effectively and spent on programs that affect the citizens of those states. Then on revenue generation, solid minerals revenue is one area where Nigeria has performed abysmally. I was looking at the 2022 report. As at November last year, we were able to generate January to November, federal government share of solid minerals revenue was less than 4 billion. And if you look across the length and breadth of the federation, almost every state in the federation is blessed with at least one mineral resource in commercial quantity. So why is it that we have not been able to, explore and develop these resources, use them as engines of, of revenue drivers and engines of growth and development for the states? These are issues that the states will need to sit down with the federal government, especially around legislature that, sort of regulates the exploration and development of solid minerals. So that's one key area where states would need to look into as revenue, generating drivers for the states. The third should be around ease of doing business. If you look at the ease of doing business with issues around security, agriculture has been one sector that has really suffered in the last, 2 years with the incidence of the farmer-header clashes. And we can see that as it regards the price of food commodities, as the case may be. So security, power infrastructure, road infrastructure, things around, eliminating multiple taxation windows and all of that are things that would, help small businesses, thrive in these states, to enable them pay taxes, to enable them create jobs, and they can employ labor, and these persons can pay taxes to the
Yeah.
government, as the case may be. What I would like to anchor it on would be around digitization, of the tax systems. In a lot of the states still, there's still, the cash system of collecting taxes, and that leaves you at the mercy of middlemen. If you look at road taxes, and I mean, Lagos is a prime example, what, transporters often pay to middlemen as road taxes are funds that, if, are properly collected by the government, can be used to fund the budget. But we see that in a lot of the states, there are a lot of tax agents, middlemen, as the case may be, who collect these taxes from citizens, but these sort of funds do not find their way, into government coffers for it to be able to use it to implement, programs that would affect the masses. So, I mean, if the state governments are able to implement some of these reforms around plugging leakages, around looking at sectors like
Yeah.
solid minerals as engines for revenue generation, and sort of digitizing their tax collection system.
Yeah.
These are, ways which states will be able to, sort of
Generate
improve
their
their
own
domestic
revenue.
resource mobilization, as the case may be.
Oh, pretty interesting conversation. I like the way you anchored this. And Mr. Ini Obong Hussein, Head of Research and Policy Advisory at Budget, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Business Nigeria.
Thanks for having me, and have a lovely day.